So you might have a client who's behaving in ways that you think they don't like you, they don't trust you, something, and it really may be just a cultural difference. So the whole goal of being culturally intelligent is to connect better with your clients and to enhance understanding and trust between you.
Welcome to episode 33 of the Innovating Advice Show. I'm joined by Stephanie Lee, founder of East Rock Financial Services in California. In this episode, we're talking about cultural intelligence and how to understand different values and behaviors in financial planning, which is the title of a great talk that Stephanie gives. She shares with us what culture means, which is far broader than ethnic and national cultures, how to select the right communication techniques with clients, and how to be open-minded and curious when working with people from various cultures and backgrounds. Links and show notes at innovatingadvice.com/episode 33. You're listening to the Innovating Advice Show, and I'm your host, Kate Holmes, bringing you the global pulse on financial services innovation, featuring financial planners, financial advisors, and related professionals from all corners of the globe. Let's dive in. Hey, Stephanie, thanks for joining the show.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for having me. I really am enjoying your podcast series.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And I so enjoyed the presentation that I saw you give. I've lost all sense of time. I don't even know if time matters anymore.
It was pre-COVID-19. That's what we know.
Yeah, right. Life now is going to be, was the event pre-COVID, during, or post? Yeah, yes. And your presentation was on cultural intelligence, on understanding different values and behaviors in financial planning. And even as someone who has worked with people and traveled all over the world for a number of years, you provided a lot of great perspectives that I want to share with listeners. And the first being is really around what culture means and all of the different categories of cultures.
Sure. So culture is really a set of behaviors and values shared by a group. Now, when I started out researching this topic, I assumed I was going to be talking about ethnic and national cultures. And I think that's what most people think of when they think about cultural differences. They think ethnic, national. But as I got into it, I thought, wow, there are so many other ways to slice and dice culture. For example, in the US, we have New York City, we have Texas, we have Hawaii. Even Northern California is very different from Southern California culturally. So there's regional differences. There are gender differences. We know men are from Mars, women are from Venus, things like that. And generationally, we have very different cultures and behaviors. Also, professionally, I realized that my tribe is really financial planners. That's where I belong most. My behaviors and values are more aligned with financial planners than they are with people from my ethnic background, maybe even my sisters who grew up in the same household. So there are many different ways to slice and dice culture. And one of my goals in putting together the presentation was to avoid stereotyping. So I didn't want to say, those Chinese people, they do this and that, and the French people do this and that. And what I decided to do was to dissect culture along different spectra of behaviors. So for example, frugality, since we're financial planners, there may be certain cultures ethnically or nationally that are known for frugality, but there's also just personality differences within a family. There you will see the frugal child and the spender child, or within professions, there's different levels of frugality. Financial planners tend to practice what we preach. We tend to cut back on things that aren't important to us and spend heavily on things that are. Yeah. So that's an example of how I wanted to avoid stereotyping, is to say there's these dimensions of behavior and people will fit somewhere along them. And certainly some of the behaviors can be common to an ethnic group or a generational group, but within those groups, there's always individuals who vary.
Yeah, hugely. And I know you resonate with financial planners, but given some other things you do, what about cultures of jazz bassists and rock violinists?
Well, certainly, yes, I do play music, and musicians have their own cultures too. And even within musicians, singers have certain reputations, drummers have different reputations, and horn players have different reputations. So there's always culture within just about any group you can imagine.
Yeah, but I just think that's so cool reading through your profile. And I was like, and jazz bassist and rock violinist. I was like, sure, of course. I love that. Like, I love how many financial planners, because I think you're right. We do kind of leverage our time and our resources and our money where it fulfills us most. And so knowing and seeing people that are going out there and doing those things is awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, Kate.
So why is cultural intelligence so important?
I think the main reason it's so important is we want to avoid misinterpreting behavior. So we might have a client who acts a certain way that we consider to be rude, perhaps. They may not smile, they may not want to shake our hands. Of course, nowadays, nobody's shaking anybody's hands. But they may avoid eye contact, which is something in the US we consider very basic to building trust, is having eye contact. But there are cultures that don't, and there are individuals within US culture who don't feel comfortable holding eye contact. So you might have a client who's behaving in ways that you think they don't like you, they don't trust you, something, and it really may be just a cultural difference. So the whole goal of being culturally intelligent is to connect better with your clients and to enhance understanding and trust between you.
Yeah, and I think opening up our minds to realize, I mean, to all the points you just provided, not assuming that anyone is going to be just like us, even if you work with a particular culture, whether you work with, doctors as a professional culture or fishermen as a, hobby or professional culture. Like you said, they're not all the same. So having that open-mindedness in any interaction that we have, whether it's with colleagues at a conference, whether it's with clients or prospects, it is realizing that, we shouldn't take everything personally. And that's what I love about cultures. I love understanding all the different things and, things that we were taught growing up. Always say please, always say thank you, always do these things. That is not a globally consistent approach.
That's right, Kate. And that's exactly why I put this presentation together, because there are so many things that we just assume because we were raised with such a strong emphasis on a certain behavior that we assume others have that behavior also.
And speaking of how we're raised, you've got a lot of different cultures within your own family.
I do. So my father was Chinese, my mother was Japanese Okinawan, and even though those are both Asian cultures, within Asia, or even outside of Asia, a lot of the cultural aspects and values are at polar opposites. They're about as alike as their food is, which is not very alike. My father was from Singapore, which is, I heard you say you haven't been there. It's got the best food. It's like a very clean New York City. Yes. And my mother was from Hawaii, which is completely laid back. My father came from a long line of educated professionals, millennia of educated people. And my mother's father had to drop out of school when he was in 5th grade after his mother died. And my grandmother dropped out of school after 8th grade so she could help out with the family. So very different levels of education. They were both, my mother's parents were both very smart people, but didn't have the education that my father's family did. My father's family is among the 5% of homeowners in Singapore. So most people do not own homes there, and his did.
Wow.
My mother spent her entire childhood until she went to college living on a farm labor camp, which is her parents worked in the sugarcane fields. So very different childhood. And then my father was Christian. His family had been Christian for generations. My mother's family had been Buddhist forever. And then, of course, what is now the biggest difference in people.
Politics.
Yes, my father was a Republican and my mother was a Democrat. And I read an interesting survey showing that what parents in America most object to over their child marrying somebody of a different ethnicity or a different religion, they object to their child marrying somebody from a different political party. So that is the biggest divider right now. And then on my in-law side, my father-in-law was Chaldean, which is a very ancient group based in what was called Mesopotamia. Today it is Iraq, but they are mentioned in Genesis chapter 11. So a very ancient group. My husband's grandfather was a shepherd in the Middle East. So very different culture there too.
So your parents went all in on the whole opposites attract thing.
They sure did. They really did. Yes.
So how was it for them? I mean, did you get to experience then all these different cultures? And is that part of what built your sort of fascination and appreciation for different cultures?
Well, like many families of that generation, of my generation, and still today, the mother did a lot of the raising. So I got more of the Japanese Hawaiian culture, and we were also visiting the Japanese Hawaiian culture more. So I identify much more with that side. But it's interesting that my dad's side really objected to the marriage because a lot of the Chinese and Japanese history is not a pleasant one. So his side objected to the marriage. I asked my grandmother, who lived to be 103, so I spent a lot of time with her in the last few years, if she objected to my mother marrying my father. And she said, no, my parents objected to my marriage. So I was going to let my children do whatever they wanted. And her parents objected because she was Okinawan marrying a Japanese person, which would be like, Okinawa has been part of Japan for, I think, centuries. So it would be like a Hawaiian objecting to their child marrying somebody from California, which does happen. I can attest to that, having family in Hawaii. So it's interesting that every group mistrusts every other group. There's no, I think there's a lot of thought among people that, racism belongs only to white people, but that is not true. Every single group I've been familiar with has been, at times, objected to outsiders.
Yep. Yeah, tons of history around that.
Yes.
So, Stephanie, I know one of the things we're always taught is the importance of communication and, talking about clients in meetings, the importance of nonverbal communication. And you mentioned it earlier, how not everyone smiles. And people that know me know I'm a big smiler, and I can tell you, I did not get that from my dad. He is so funny. I don't think I've ever in my life seen my dad get angry. He's a super even keel guy, really jolly person. But when meeting someone new, and I was thinking about this during your presentation, because you have a slide with a picture on it. And I was thinking about my dad, and anytime I've gone with him to meet someone, whether it was in school or just any new meeting, he will not smile. There has never been a picture in history of my dad smiling. It's so funny. But that is one of those challenging things that thankfully I grew up with him not smiling. So I recognize it in other cultures, but that can be hard for a lot of people. If you are a happy person and you think, hey, this person isn't reciprocating my smile, either they're unhappy or, they don't want to engage.
Yeah, that's right, Kate. And one thing I've enjoyed about your podcast is I can hear you smiling in your voice, in your delivery. I can hear you smiling. So it makes me happy to hear that. So the slide that I show at the start of my talk are the native NATO spouses from, I believe it was 2017 or 18. It's about 12 or 13 people, mostly Western cultures. And about 1/3 have the smile that the US likes with our teeth showing. And about 1/3 have a grin, closed mouth grin. Sometimes on some people looks a little pained. And then 1/3 look like they're attending a funeral. They have a very somber look on their faces. And again, they knew this photo would go around the world. And again, several of them are from Western European cultures, so very similar to ours in other ways. I read about a Norwegian government agency that put out a pamphlet saying, if you see a stranger approaching you and smiling, they're either drunk, insane, or an American.
What?
So the Americans have a reputation for smiling more than most cultures. And most cultures, I've talked with a few people from different cultures, and they, from Germany and from Britain in particular, they've said that they see the American smile as insincere because we smile even if we're not happy. We're smiling just as a greeting. And so that's why we can expect that some clients will not smile back at us. But it doesn't mean they're not happy or that they don't like us. It's just not part of, or as you mentioned, your father isn't a smiler. There are plenty of people in the US, Caucasian Americans who have been here for generations who do not smile very easily either. It's just a personality trait sometimes.
So would you recommend, especially when meeting with a new client or prospect in person, to emulate what they do?
A lot of my advice, Kate, is to mirror your client. Now, smiling, somebody who's in the US anyway, will know that this is what we US people do. So I don't think you should necessarily not smile if it's natural for you to smile. I also don't think as I mentioned before, it's not natural for some people to hold eye contact, and that doesn't mean you should look away necessarily, because if they're not looking at you, they can't tell that you're not looking at them or
True.
looking at them. But I do think mirroring clients' behavior around many of these behaviors is an important way to make your client feel comfortable. Now, one thing we don't want to do is be inauthentic. But we change our behavior all the time, depending on whom we're with. So, for example, I get together with my college roommates, and we revert to 19-year-old behavior.
Oh, yes.
And we have a great time, but it's not something we want our children to see, how we behave and talk and even eat. If I'm around children, I behave a different way than with my college roommates. So we do this all the time. We are constantly adjusting to whom we are chatting with, and I recommend doing that with your clients so that they feel more comfortable too.
Well, and there's also a book that I just went and grabbed, and it's called Covering by Kenji Yoshino. And I saw him speak, and it's the subtitle is The Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights. And I've read bits and pieces. It looks like I'm a third of the way through, but it talks about that and how we cover up who we are based on being in different situations. And most of the time it's subconscious. You get with your girlfriends from college and that's how you act. You get around kids and you just kind of adapt to the situation. That's right.
Yes, we all do that all the time. Or we get with our siblings and we become the person according to our birth order that we were, or with parents, we become their children. So it happens all the time, and there's nothing that's insincere, not authentic about it. We can still be our authentic selves. It's just different people bring out different sides of ourselves, and to make your client comfortable, then mirroring some of their behavior and some of their language in particular too, can make them feel more at ease.
Yep. And another one that kind of made me laugh during your presentation, talking about direct versus indirect communication. And I know we shouldn't stereotype, but I had to laugh to myself because I've spent a ton of time in Europe and with wonderful people that I have a great time with. But I find a lot of the European men, they will say it. They will say, this is our culture. We interrupt all the time and just constantly interrupting. And I'm not offended by that at all. I know that that's how it goes, but that can be a tough thing for some people, is that interrupting.
Yeah, it's very cultural how much you interrupt and how much space you have in your conversation. And I think about two of my college friends. They were put together as roommates. One was from New York City and the other was from Kentucky. And they have different levels of conversational space in those cultures. So my friend from New York City told me, I was taught to talk until I'm interrupted. And I also was taught that if I want to say something, I interrupt. And my friend from Kentucky was taught to never interrupt and to wait till somebody's done talking before speaking up. So the first 2 weeks, the friend from New York said to me, I thought that Anne never spoke because she never said anything. And then one time I had to take a drink of water in between what I was saying, and she spoke. And I was shocked. She can talk and she had something interesting to say. So then I learned that if I just waited longer than I thought was humanly possible to wait, she would say something.
Yep.
So yes, it is part of our culture. And as advisors, we have to allow space for people to speak if we are used to not, if we're used to waiting to be interrupted. And we also may have to ask questions if we want to say something and the person isn't speaking. Just stop and ask what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Make sure both partners are allowed to speak too. So that is one difference. And then also, as you said, as you pointed out with your European friends, don't take offense if they do interrupt you, because that just might be what they were brought up to do.
Exactly. Well, and that idea of pausing, a lot of people can be super uncomfortable with silence. And like you said, with your New York friend, or kind of waiting longer than you ever thought possible. Sometimes a 5-second pause can feel longer than 3 hours. So especially as advisors and, clients, when you're going through emotional things, if you've got some trauma in your life, leaving room for those pauses, because it might take a long time for someone to get the courage to speak up.
That's right, Kate. And that is something that I think most advisors that I've worked with, I've been really impressed. As a group, it's a group of good listeners. And that's great, because that's so important in our career. But the other part about direct versus indirect communication is that in some cultures and some personalities, people will say things that we might consider rude. For example, a lot of cultures will comment on weight. Now, in the US, if you tell somebody, wow, looks like you gained weight, that is just about the worst thing you can say. In fact, I read a website advising tourists to the US saying, make sure you don't call anybody fat, because that's the biggest taboo in America, is to call somebody fat. And it's really hard because they do mostly look large compared to whatever culture this was from. I think it was someplace in Asia. So in other cultures, it's not taboo to say, wow, look at the weight you've gained. So be aware of that, or to comment on anything about your appearance, like, oh, you're getting more bald or something. That is not considered an insult. It's just an observation. And that's something that can be very uncomfortable in our culture when we're not used to somebody being that direct about appearance.
Yes. Yeah. I remember my first time I think I was in Thailand, and I went shopping somewhere, and just a little tiny store, and the gentleman there was, Thailand, the land of, smiles and super friendly. And he honestly gave me the once over, and he was just like, too fat.
Oh.
I don't think I was fat at all back then.
I'm sure you were.
Not that I'm now, but it was so funny. I just looked around and I was like, really? But honestly, it was kind of endearing. Like, I'm obviously just not easily offended. And I love all the nuances of the different cultures, but sometimes you also have to be really sensitive. And when you think about indirect, one of the things is around talking about death. And unfortunately, we've got a lot of that going on right now. So where are some of the lines in terms of talking about death with clients from different cultures?
That's a good question, Kate, and very relevant, because not only we have death going on now, but there's always death, right? That's
always.
One thing that is constantly happening. And as financial advisors, we have to talk about death and illness and incapacity, because we want clients to plan for the potential of disability, of long-term care, of dying, so they have their estate plan in order. And I'm sure everybody listening to this has seen a wide range of comfort and discomfort around these topics. So one thing that's important to remember is that for many people, it's actually a taboo to mention illness or death. And so that makes it really difficult as financial planners to bring it up. And this is another case where mirroring the client's behavior and their language can be helpful. For example, one thing I learned relatively recently, and I learned it, I've been fortunate not to have dementia in my family, but there's a big stigma around dementia for many, many people of varying cultures. It's considered something shameful and embarrassing. So they don't necessarily want it mentioned. that their spouse has dementia or that they have dementia. So there's a lot of tiptoeing you have to do when there's illness or death, and I do recommend mirroring the client's language. So, for example, we generally use the term passed away, or we use lots of euphemisms at the end of your financial plan. It's one thing that we as financial planners say because it's more comfortable. But one thing I also learned is most of the people I know, when they have a loved one die, they want to talk about their loved one. They want to hear that person's names. They want to hear memories that you have about that person. But there are also people who consider it rude or a taboo to mention somebody who has recently died. And I'll give a story from my own experience. It was 12 years ago yesterday, actually, that my father was hit by a truck, the proverbial truck, and he died. And 2 weeks after that, I had a business trip to Singapore where I would see his family and his friends. And they all knew about this. I received cards from many of them. And I was nervous about having my aunt arrange for a big dinner party with 21 people. I was nervous about it, thinking, oh my goodness, I know that it's not a culture where I should be crying openly. So I'm going to have to button it down, but it's going to be hard with all of them mentioning my dad. To my shock, not a single person mentioned my dad or mentioned him passing, except one aunt who, as she hugged me, said, "It's so sad." That's all I heard the entire night about my dad. And these were people who grew up with him. And so it wasn't until I was doing this presentation research that I realized, oh, it was considered taboo or rude or something to mention my dad after he recently passed.
Interesting. Well, so there's got to be ways for financial planners to, as you said, tiptoe around that, because when it comes to a financial plan, those topics and life changes are incredibly important, and they need to be addressed.
Yes, and I think most financial planners have gotten good about doing that, like saying things like, okay, if you survive this person, so you're focused on the person alive, or how do you take care of your family if something were to happen. I think we use a lot of if something were to happen, that's kind of vague. And then if you're dealing with somebody who has had a spouse or loved one pass recently, rather than saying necessarily, mentioning the person's name immediately or mentioning their death in case it's somebody whose culture around this you are not familiar with, you can just ask the client, how have you been lately? How have your days been? And take the cue from them as to how they respond. If they bring up their loved one's name, then that means it's okay to mention their name. If they mention some memories, then maybe you want to share your memories too. So again, we're just taking cues from our clients as to what they're comfortable with.
I like that, Stephanie. So starting with those open-ended questions rather than we might naturally jump into, I'm so sorry for your loss and all those, approaching it right off the bat. But yeah, if you start with, just ask that open-ended question and see what they come back with.
That's right, Kate. And also, as I mentioned, illness is a taboo or an uncomfortable topic for many people, even from your standard American culture. It's also an issue of privacy, but it's relevant to us as financial planners to find out that a client has some sort of illness. So that again just takes some sensitivity, just listening and not necessarily being so direct about, so what did you get diagnosed with,
Right.
But finding out like, how are you feeling and how are you feeling about the future? Because, for example, when my mother-in-law was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she was a Polish American here for 4 generations, she managed to tell me that she had breast cancer without ever saying the word breast or cancer. She just talked around it in ways until I got the message.
Interesting.
So even again, within the standard American culture, there's a lot of discomfort with illness, and particularly when it's one's own illness too.
Sure. So, Stephanie, one of the other really memorable parts of your presentation, and honestly, there were a lot, but was around talking about sort of individualist versus collectivist and the story of the Thai soccer boys rescue.
I was so fascinated by that Thai soccer issue. I think the whole world was, which was just about 2 years ago next month. It seems like it was a long time ago because, again, it was a pre-COVID. Everything pre-COVID seems like an eternity ago. But we in the US are the most individualistic culture in the world. And because it is the culture we live with, it's a given to us. And our focus is on our own well-being, maybe that of our loved ones. Whereas in other cultures, in fact, 70% of the world is more what is called collectivist. And they are more focused on the community's well-being. And their individual needs are subverted or not as important as the community's needs or the group's needs. So for example, with the Thai soccer team, there were so many different cultural differences that came out in that. For example, when the children were found, they were calm. They were even smiling. And I was just thinking, man, if I'd been stuck in a cave, I would have been just screaming when somebody appeared out of the water. But that's a cultural difference. They've been taught to meditate, and the Thai culture is not so effusive too. But what I found especially fascinating was once the children were taken out 4 at a time over the course of 3 days. And I noticed when they brought them out, they used an umbrella to cover up the child. And I was thinking, why are they covering up which child this is? I read that the authorities chose not to tell the parents which child was taken out until they were all out. So parents were not allowed, if your child was in the first group, you did not know that, and you did not get to see your child until all of the children were out. And there wasn't even questioning about it, because the thought was, what matters is that the whole group gets out, that all the parents and the children, all the children are safe and the parents can see them then. So that is just unfathomable in the US. If your child had been missing in a cave and then went through this dangerous rescue, you would want to see that child the second the child came out. And then what was also fascinating is the boys apologized to their parents for causing them to worry. Wow. Because another big difference in culture is youth orientation versus elder orientation. And in the US, we're very youth oriented. The whole family is centered around caring for the child. Whereas in other cultures, the family is centered around caring for the elders and making sure the elders are okay. So the boys felt bad that they had caused their parents to worry. And then 6 days after leaving the hospital, so they'd been separated from their parents for a long time. There were all the missing days that they were gone, and then the rescue days, and then they were in the hospital. They got to be home for 6 days before they went into a monastery for 10 days. And again, you cannot imagine that happening here where, okay, my missing child is now here. Oh, okay, yeah, go off for 10 days to the monastery or anywhere. I mean, that child would probably have their parents next to them for the next 20 years. You know?
Yep.
So that's a big difference in culture and thinking of the collective good. Well, that was a religious difference, going to the monastery for 10 days to honor the person who gave his life and to recover from the event. So that was a religious difference. And then you have the cultural difference of apologizing to the parents. And then you have the individualist versus collectivist difference, where what matters is the group's health and not any individual's child's health.
And Stephanie, what an interesting time are we in now when you're talking about caring about your own health versus the collective health of everyone. It has been fascinating to watch and see how people are approaching this, and that's really falling everywhere on the spectrum of that individualist versus collective. But that's a great example of, I think, why it's so important to understand these cultural differences, because I think there are so many great things we can learn from each other. And not that any one cultural difference is necessarily better than another, but that's a great story of, as you were talking, and I heard the story before, but all I kept thinking, the amount of times that lawyer popped into my head as you were talking about, Like they come out and I was like, yep, parents would be lawyering up. They would be suing in the US on the media. Like, what a shame.
Yes, no, we have a very litigious society, and I thought that too, that a parent would have sued to get access to their child. And in fact, one of the rescuers sued Elon Musk for defamation because Elon Musk had made a comment about he was a pedophile or something. Well, the amount he sued for is also shocking to an American. I mean, if you had your name around the world being described as a pedophile and you're suing Elon Musk, you would try to break the bank there. The man sued him for $75,000. I think he was either British or Australian, one of the divers.
Wow.
And $75,000 for Elon Musk, it's like just pay it out of like today's interest, from in your bank, rather than spending to fight it with an attorney who would cost that much in the first month, probably. Sure. So yeah, there is that difference too.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And you brought up, Kate, the way different cultures are handling the coronavirus lockdown. And so you do see a big difference here with the success. As you said, it's not that one culture is better than another. They're just different. But there are some cultures that are better in a situation like this.
Yes.
Because they are more likely to do what is best for the collective, as well as to listen to authority, as well as to give up some privacy for the sake of the community health. So one of the big important aspects to have in place is contact tracing.
Yep.
And that means some loss of privacy potentially with what's out there now. I know there's work in tech companies to make that so there's no privacy loss with that. But in other countries, it doesn't matter that there's a privacy loss. Everybody does it, or maybe they haven't been given a choice to have all their contacts traced. I think they haven't been given the choice, but that makes for better public health in this situation.
Yes. Well, I'd say I definitely fall more on the do what's good for the collective, but everyone's different. Yeah. So there are so many things around body language, around expressiveness, social hierarchy, time. I mean, we could go on forever. You mentioned in our pre-chat that if you were just giving this as a presentation, that you could do it for 3 hours, which I think would honestly just be fascinating. I'd love to find an opportunity to do that. And you will actually give this presentation to firms and groups. So talk us through what that would look like.
Yeah, so I've done this presentation a number of times to different, some of them have been financial planning groups, some have been estate planning groups, and just some were just regular business groups. So I'm happy to do this presentation for any group of people. I generally want 12 to 20 to make it have more of an impact. And these days I can do it via Zoom or I can do it in person, either way.
Yeah, so Zoom, you can do it with anyone around the world. So even as everyone is socially distanced, and if you've got employees working from home, thinking a lot about even larger companies, banks, and organizations where you're going to definitely be interacting with all sorts of different cultures. And you touched in the beginning that doesn't just mean racial or geographic, and having that cultural awareness. It's almost like an element of EQ.
That's right. It is. Absolutely. And actually, my best friend from high school wrote the bestseller book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0. So,
oh, no way.
I feel like I was so fortunate to go to high school with somebody who became the expert on EQ because she certainly trained me along the way.
That's fantastic. I've got that book right here behind me.
Oh, great.
Stephanie, thank you for your time today. What would you sort of leave listeners with as a final thought?
Well, thank you, Kate, for your time and for the invitation. I've really enjoyed this. And as I said, I really appreciate all your work toward expanding the horizons and knowledge of financial planners around the world. My feeling about life, and we realize it more in times like this that are stressful, is that nothing matters more than human connection. Really, nothing matters more than human connection. And so I encourage all listeners to be curious and to find ways to connect with those whose background is different from yours, or their behaviors are different from yours, but you still have something in common. You are human beings on this planet, and you will find some good out of connecting with them and some reward and meaning from doing so. So be curious, connect with people.
Stephanie, I love that. What a fantastic final thought. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Thanks for listening to the Innovating Advice Show. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn and shoot me a thought or two. Link to my profile is right below. Stay safe, stay well, and I look forward to hearing from you.